Welcome to our webinar on how to tighten permissions using access analysis. I'm Andrea Nedic, presenting together with Matangi Ramesh, and we are Senior Product Managers for Access Analysis at AWS. Tightening permissions is a goal for many of our customers, so we are excited to demo how you can do that today. We hear from our customers that their goal is to enable their business to innovate, enable their developers to move fast, and give their developers the freedom to build. At the same time, they want to maintain the security posture as they scale and ensure least privilege access control for their users and the applications they build. Our goal is to provide you with features and mechanisms that make it easier for you to achieve least privilege. So today we'll demo how you can do that, how to review access, how to recognize broad access, and how to reduce access. The question essential to achieving least privilege is who can access what? So let's break it down. The who are your users or applications. The what are your resources shared within an account or shared across multiple accounts. And then you have the permissions in the middle, which are granting access and connecting the two. As you add more resources, more accounts, more users, and build more in AWS, your permissions change and grow. So you achieve least privilege by continuously tightening permissions over time. And on this least privilege journey, you want to be able to review and understand your access. And in reviewing your access, you want to be able to easily recognize broad access. Once you identify broad access, you want to make decisions on how to modify permissions to reduce access. An access analysis in AWS helps you achieve least privilege and scale permissions management by providing insight into who can access what across your AWS environments. This makes it easier for you to review access, recognize broad access, and reduce access with confidence.
We hear customers saying that their administrators are usually the gatekeepers who grant permissions to the users and roles in their account. With businesses growing and activities in their AWS account increasing, customers wonder, how do we scale to keep up with all of these changes? They want an easy way to review access. In reviewing access, there are a set of questions customers typically ask. Here you see an account containing your AWS resources, and this is the most important barrier you have. So an important question they ask here is, who can access my resources from outside my account? Which are the resources that they can access, and what all actions can they take? This includes public access, cross-account access, and access from outside the organization. This is the first level of review, is to ensure that the accounts are accessible only for the intended external principals. Next, then they try to review the account level permissions to identify who can access their resources from within their accounts. These can be developers who use their permissions to work within your AWS environments, or roles for applications that you're launching into production. Administrators would say, I gave them these permissions 3 months ago, but is there an easier way to review what they have without really having to read through policies? For example, here, if Mary is a user in your account, administrators would want to answer questions like, does Mary have permissions to access S3? And we have traditionally seen customers starting with broad access and letting developers experiment with the available services. And once the patterns of usage have normalized, they question, I gave them these permissions a while ago. Do they need all of these permissions? For example, here, they know that, yes, Mary can access S3. The question that they want to answer is, did Mary use S3? Does she need continued access to S3? In a nutshell, they try to review who used the permissions granted to the user and the role so that they can make decisions to clean up unused or unwanted permissions. So here, to address these questions, AWS IAM supports 2 techniques that you can use to review and reduce, to review access and reduce permissions. IAM Access Analyzer helps you identify the resources in your organization and accounts, such as the S3 buckets and IAM roles that are shared with an external entity. This helps you protect your AWS resources from unintended external access by automatically monitoring and analyzing the access control policies that you have. Next, IAM last accessed information reports the last time an IAM user or role used any service or an S3 action. This helps you identify what permissions have not been used recently and reduce those permissions confidently. Next, Andrea will explain these features in detail and show you how you can recognize broad access.
Next, I'll walk you through how access analysis features can help you recognize broad access. So let's go back to the earlier example. I have an S3 bucket, a KMS key, and an IAM role in my prod account, and I want to know who can access my resources from outside of the account. To do that, I can use Access Analyzer to answer who can access these resources publicly or from another account or organization. In this example, Access Analyzer can tell me that there is a security audit account that can access resources in the prod account, which is what I intended. A different project account can also access the bucket, which I also intended. But there is a non-production account that can access the bucket, and I recognize this cross-account access as too broad. Because Access Analyzer provided insight that helped me recognize broad access, I can update the bucket policy to tighten permissions. So what does IAM Access Analyzer do? Access Analyzer continuously monitors for new or updated resource policies and analyzes resource permissions for your S3 buckets, KMS keys, SQSQs, IAM roles, and Lambda functions and layers. It generates comprehensive findings that identify resources that can be accessed publicly or from outside an AWS account or organization. And it uses automated reasoning, a form of mathematical logic and inference, to determine all possible access paths allowed by a resource policy. So these analytical results provide the highest levels of security assurance of the cloud and in the cloud. And this helps you recognize broad cross-account access to your resources. So how do you use Access Analyzer? All you need to do is create an analyzer for your account or organization. As an example, let's say you create an account analyzer. As soon as you create the analyzer, Access Analyzer starts scanning all of the supported resources within your account and generates a finding when a resource can be accessed from outside of your account. Similarly, if you create an analyzer for your organization, Access Analyzer will generate findings for resources that can be accessed from outside of the organization. And each finding includes details about the access, and you can review each finding to decide if the access is intended. If it's intended, you can archive the findings so you can focus on reviewing findings that matter to you. And if the access is not intended, you can resolve the finding by scoping down the policy to remove the access to the resource. So let's go to a demo to see what that looks like. I am in the IAM console, and I have selected Access Analyzer from the left side nav panel. This brings me to the Access Analyzer landing page where I can read more about the feature, look at the documentation of the user guide, and review the benefits. I select Create Analyzer to start creating my analyzer. And since Access Analyzer is a regional service, when I create an analyzer, I create it for a specific region. And the analyzer is for that account for that region. In this case, I am in US West 2. And I have the option to modify the default analyzer name, but for the demo, I will leave it as is. Then I have the option of selecting the zone of trust. If I select the current account as a zone of trust, Access Analyzer will generate findings for resources within my account that can be accessed from outside of the account. And if I select the organization as my zone of trust, Access Analyzer will give me findings for resources that can be accessed from outside the organization. For the purpose of this demo, I will select the current account to generate my analyzer. And when you enable Access Analyzer, a service-linked role is created in your account, which grants Access Analyzer permissions to interact with the AWS resources and analyze their permissions on your behalf. So I select Create Analyzer, and immediately Access Analyzer begins analyzing my resource permissions and generating findings for the resources in my account that can be accessed from outside of the account. Here at the top, I see the analyzer name, and the zone of trust is the current account that I just set up. And as I scroll down, I can see that there are many findings generated for different resource types like IAM roles and S3 buckets in my account. I see now that the analyzer creation is complete, and I could go through each and every finding and review it in order as they appear, but today for the demo, I really want to focus on findings for my S3 buckets. So I have the option of filtering down the findings based on the finding criteria. And to look at the S3 bucket findings, I will select the resource type, and I'll see all the resources supported by Access Analyzer. And here I can select S3 buckets. Immediately, I see that for this account in this region, I have 2 bucket findings. And here in the resource column, I can see the names of the buckets that are shared. I can also see the external principals that can access each bucket. And in the shared through column, I can see how the bucket is shared. In this case, the bucket policy and the access point grant this access to the buckets. Access Analyzer takes into account the bucket BPA settings, the bucket policies, the ACLs, the access point policies, and the access point BPA settings in generating S3 bucket findings. I can also see the access level scope granted for each resource. I see that for the first finding, the access level enables write tagging read list actions, while the other finding shows only list actions. So I want to find out more, and first I'll check out this finding by clicking on it. This takes me to the finding details page, where I can see exactly the resource shared, which will link me to the S3 console. I can also see the account that has access to my bucket. And I can see a bit more detail here about which exact access point is granting access to my bucket. I can also see more detail about the access level and the actions. And now when I review each finding, I can decide to archive the finding if I think the access is intended, or I can decide to remediate the resource permissions if I decide that this cross-account access is not intended. In this case, I did intend to give this external account access to this particular bucket, so I will decide to archive it by selecting Archive. And I can see that the status has already changed to archived. And when I go back to my findings page, I can see that this finding we just looked at shows up in the Archive tab. Okay, now I want to go back to my active findings and take a look at that remaining bucket finding. Okay, I want to look into this one, so I click on the finding details. This finding is telling me that the bucket allows public access. There's a warning banner at the top. And this is because any principal can access my bucket under any condition. This type of access is definitely not what I intended. So I will take a look at the access point that allows the access and remediate the policy. When I click on the access point and open up a new tab, this takes me to the S3 console where I can see the access point policy. And I can see that the access point policy is granting any principal access to the bucket under any condition. And here for the purpose of the demo, I will just do a quick fix and change this to an explicit deny. But depending on your use case, you might decide to resolve this by updating the bucket policy or applying block public access settings. So after I've updated this access point policy, I go back to my finding. And because Access Analyzer continuously scans for changes in resource permissions, I should see this finding resolved in up to 20 minutes. But because I know I just changed the policy, I can also decide to rescan this finding and see the update immediately. So I select rescan, and I see now that the finding is resolved. And when I go back to the findings page, I can see this particular finding we just looked at in the Resolve tab. So that gives you an overview of how to use Access Analyzer. I would also like to take you through our integration with the S3 console. Access Analyzer findings can be found within the S3 console. And here you can see in Amazon S3, there is a feature called Access Analyzer for S3. And when you select it, you are provided with a list of your buckets that allow public access, as well as a list of your buckets that provide cross-account access. And this integration helps you see your Access Analyzer findings close to where you take action on your bucket permissions. So in this case, if I hadn't resolved my bucket with public access, I would see the bucket finding. I do see my my cross-account bucket finding that I just recently archived. And the nice thing about this integration is if you have a bucket with public access, you are able to select it and block all public access to that bucket within the S3 console. So that concludes the first demo, but stay tuned for one more by Matangi. To get started with Access Analyzer, you can use the IAM console or the Access Analyzer APIs. We already talked about the Access Analyzer integration with the Amazon S3 console, but Access Analyzer also integrates with AWS Security Hub, which provides Access Analyzer findings aggregated at the resource level. Access Analyzer also has an integration with CloudWatch events. For example, when a new finding gets generated or an active finding gets resolved, findings changes are emitted in the form of CloudWatch events. And finally, you can use CloudFormation templates to create analyzers across multiple accounts. Another way to recognize broad access is by identifying unused permissions. To help with this, IAM reports the last time users and roles used each service, so you can recognize broad access and remove unused permissions confidently without impacting the users and applications using them. IAM also reports action last accessed information for Amazon S3 to help you recognize unused S3 actions. So let's walk through an example of how you can recognize unused permissions with service last access information. In this example, I'm responsible for managing access to my company's IAM principals, and I review permissions periodically. Normally, finding out actual activity may be time-consuming, but with service and action last access information, I can see that Bob has recently used an IAM role to access S3, EC2, SQS, and SNS, but has not accessed Athena in the tracking period. This information helps me recognize that I can reduce access to unused services by updating those policies.
Once you recognize broad access, you want to now remove them. Here in this section, I'll talk about a few options to reduce access to your account. First, you can review when a role was last used and remove unused roles. Role last used is a timestamp that shows when someone used a role's credentials the last time to take an action. This helps you condense roles in your account to just the relevant ones and simplify your permissions management process. Next, you can do the same for the users in your account. You can look at the user's last activity to identify the users that have been recently used. And finally, as described in the previous section, cross-account access that you scrutinized using Access Analyzer, you can remove the unintended access by updating those policies. Now that you have only the roles and users that you know are required and actively being used. The roles are being used, but are all the permissions granted to it required? To answer this, you can review the permissions granted to these entities within your account and just retain the required permissions. You can start at the top layer, that is the AWS organization. And here, administrators use service control policies to establish permission guardrails that all the roles and users within your organization adhere to. You can review the last accessed information for all of these services you have granted permissions for through the SCPs and remove the unused services, or at least the crucial ones. Next, you can do the same for the IAM policies that are attached to your roles and users in your account. Review the permissions, the service level permissions, and the S3 grant actions that have been granted access to for your roles and your users, and remove the unused ones. Let's quickly review how you can use the last accessed information. Select the role of your choice that you want to update permissions for. You might want to start with the more crucial roles like production roles, or you might choose to work on all of them together by automating a routine cleanup. Then visit the Access Advisor tab in console for the role of your choice and filter out the services that have not been used recently, say in the last 90 days. And you can do the same for S3 actions. This helps you analyze and restrict access for your sensitive buckets. Once you've identified the permissions to remove, look up the associated policies and update them. Let me quickly demo this for you. This is my test account, and I've accessed this through an admin role. To look at the roles and users, you need to go into your IAM console. I'm going to show you how to clean up the roles in your account. So I'll visit the roles page. And here I see that I have a bunch of roles, and there is last activity information here. So if I sort based on this, you see that there's a lot of roles that have not been used recently. If I pick the first role, which is test role, I see that it was created roughly a while ago, and it does have broad permissions, administrator access, but it has not been used recently. So with this information, I am pretty confident that I want to delete this role. As it's not been actively used, and reduce the number of roles that I want to monitor. So you can do the same for all the other roles in your account. And now that assuming that we have finished that activity, I'll pick up a role that was used fairly recently, say IAM tester. So you see that it was created a while ago and it was used as recently as today. And to review the permissions granted to this role, I visit the Access Advisor tab. And here I see that this role has been granted access to CloudWatch, SNS, Security Hub, and a few other services. Some of them have been used recently versus Lambda and CloudFront were not used in the last 90 days. So with this information, I want to remove access to these two services. So what I see here is the associated policies that grant these permissions to these services. So I'm going to click on this policy and update it to remove CloudFront and Lambda access. It takes a while to load. I'm going to edit the policy to remove Lambda and CloudFront. I review the policy. I see that it has the permissions that I wanted to retain, and then I save the changes. So now if I go back and update this role, I should see that the services that I removed are no longer here. Next, I want to use this new capability that we launched a few months ago, which is to review the actions within S3 and see when an action was last accessed. So here I see all the S3 management actions that this role has permissions to and when it was last used. And I noticed that get access point, for example, has not been used in the last 90 days. And further, I see there are a lot of actions like delete bucket that have not been used recently. So I want to come back to this page and decide to update this policy. Here I notice that this policy provides only S3 permissions to this role. So what you can do is you can look at all the actions that are here sorted based on the last accessed information and then filter out the actions that you want to remove. So if I want to remove delete bucket and say create job, I'm going to do that. Let me edit the policy first. And what was the other one? It was the create job, yes. So I remove access to these actions, review the policy, and then save the changes. There are definitely more actions here that needs to be removed, and you can do the same thing for all the actions. And then I refresh the page here and I see I need to go back into S3 and I notice that the create job and delete bucket actions have been removed. And you can do the same activity for the users in your account and the service control policies to reduce access. A quick recap of what we talked about here today. We covered the common use cases for which you would review access. Who can access your resources from outside your account, who has what permissions within your account, and who did use those permissions. Next, we learned how to use Access Analyzer to identify unintended external access available and how to use last accessed information to see the available permissions and when they were last used. Finally, we talked about how you can reduce access, remove unused roles, remove unused users, and update your policies to remove unused permissions, especially the SD actions. And all of these steps get you closer to least privilege, which is to retain just the required permissions. You can use these capabilities through console or the APIs. To learn more about IAM Access Analyzer and IAM Last Accessed Information, visit the Analyze Access feature page on AWS. Thank you so much for your time. We are happy to answer any questions that you have for us. We are passionate about this space and would love to share more in the future. So let us know what you want to hear more about. Thank you.